Today is all about community-centric fundraising, transforming nonprofit practices for equity and impact. That's a big title. But essentially, we're going to be learning about community-centric fundraising, and I'm excited to bring this to the Candid audience. I'm Yvonne Sims, Educational Programming Manager, and I'm sitting in Atlanta, Georgia, where the sun has come out. I'm excited. And also we have one of our magical people in the background doing all of the great things. You know Carla if you've been here. If you've been here before, you probably know that Candid is the coming together of Foundation Center and GuideStar. And they became Candid in 2019. So it's been 5 years now. Oh God, 6 years now. And we are an organization that tracks data in the nonprofit sectors to allow the sector to do good. We do that through research, collaboration, and training like the one we're doing today. Yay, we're at the good part. So our speaker today, Andrea Arenas, is the founder and principal of her own thing, Andrea Arenas Consulting, and is also one of the co-founders of Community Centric Funding. So I'm going to stop sharing and let her come on. But as I do that, we're always curious who's here because there's a lot of you in the room today, and we're just curious, like, who decided to stop in today? And we know we have a lot of executive directors, so I put that first. I also put I'm on the development team, which means, you could be the director of development or just one of the staff, a fundraiser essentially as your main gig at the nonprofit. I am a nonprofit consultant. I realize we have a lot of those. I'm on the board of a nonprofit. You might be here as a board member, which I love, by the way. And then I'm on the programs team of a nonprofit. So you might be one of the people that's kind of direct service doing what you do. So I'm gonna let you fill that out. Let's see. Oh, y'all are so fast. We're already at 74%. You can see that too, right, Andrea?
I can, yeah.
Okay, good, good. So I'm gonna go ahead and end it, but I'm so glad y'all are very awake in the beginning. I should put all my polls in the beginning. I'm gonna end it and share. And wow. So what do you think, Andrew? We have 19% are executive directors, 51% on the development team. You better give people
I
some money or something.
I expected this. This seems
Really?
right, but I
I mean,
always love
we're talking
I
about
love when the
fundraising.
fundraisers come out, but I also love when the non-fundraisers come out. So thank you for
Okay.
being here.
Yeah, we see 9% nonprofit consulting, 8% on the board, and 13% on the programs team. So I'm going to stop sharing so Andrea can introduce herself and everyone can close that poll.
Thank you so much, Yvonne, and
Of
thanks for
course.
having me here today.
Of course, of course.
Mhm. Hi everybody. First, I just want to say, so happy to be here. I'm also recovering from the flu, so I'm probably going to be speaking slower than usual, and you'll see all sorts of different cups and mugs in front of me as we go through this today. So thanks for bearing with me. My name is Andrea Arenas. I use she, her pronouns, and I live and work in Seattle, Washington. As Yvonne said, I'm a nonprofit and philanthropy consultant focused on equitable fundraising and grant making approaches. And before becoming a consultant, I worked for a philanthropic foundation where I led prospective grantee outreach in the Puget Sound area. And before that, I was the director of development at the Seattle Parks Foundation, where I led individual, corporate, and institutional giving for the organization, as well as supporting a number of fiscally sponsored neighborhood-led groups with their fundraising goals and capacity. I'm also one of the 10 founding members of community-centric fundraising. So today I'm going to provide a brief overview of community-centric fundraising, which I will abbreviate as CCF, including why it was created, how it was created, and then we'll begin to unpack the 10 principles of CCF. I'll also share some examples from organizations that have actualized the principles to help shift their fundraising to be more equitable. We'll also have some time for comments and questions at the end so we can hopefully learn from one another and really see if CCF resonates with you. And Yvonne, if you see any questions that you think would be great to talk about during, please point them out to me. I'm happy to do that.
Absolutely.
So before we get into CCF, I always like to start with some visioning. So take some time, imagine, what if the work of nonprofits were not viewed as individual, but as part of a larger constellation representing community and social justice? And in that constellation, all funding was unrestricted, and we didn't have to exaggerate how low our overhead is. What if the sector could see our clients not just as recipients of our nonprofit services, but as vital contributors to the community? What if all nonprofit staff were compensated fairly, with respect and appreciation, and received a thriving wage? What if we worked as hard as we do towards donors to retain and appreciate staff, volunteers, board members, clients, and neighbors? And what if rather than creating a sense of charity among donors towards other community members, we instead recognized that everyone personally benefits from engaging in the work? So I'd love to learn if you already know a bit about CCF. So we have a poll for you. Thank you, Yvonne and the Candid team. How familiar are you with CCF principles? Never heard of them, heard of it but don't know much, am somewhat familiar or very familiar, and actively practice CCF.
This is interesting to see. Do you feel like,
Mhm.
Andrea, that this is that we need to be on the West Coast to know more about CCF, you think?
Not necessarily. I'll share more
Mhm.
about how we've grown, but it's
Okay.
kind of exciting to be with a group that has half of you have never heard of CCF. So
I know. I'm
I'm
excited too.
intrigued that you're here today. So thank you.
Yeah, me too. So yeah, so what we're seeing on our end, and I'll end it now. I've never heard of CCF 53%, so this is great. I'm glad you're here then. I've never heard of, but don't know much. Yeah, don't know much. 21%. I'm somewhat familiar with the principles, 22%, and I'm very familiar and actively practice. Ooh, we got to get them up here.
Thank you to those 14
4%.
people.
Yeah. Oh, and I'm sorry, I didn't share. So you can all look real quick and then we'll stop sharing. Go ahead, Andrea.
No, I'm excited to talk to
Mm.
you all today, and thanks for coming here, having either never heard about it or only known a little bit. So I hope this is a good introduction for you and shows that sometimes we get some feedback that CCF feels scary, and that's something we also want to unpack today. So I'd be very curious to know if it feels scary after this. So thank you all. So, in order to reimagine or improve systems, we need to examine how nonprofit and philanthropic systems came to be. And the reality is, philanthropic foundations are primarily funded through extractive practices. When we think about our country's oldest and largest philanthropic foundations, many accumulated wealth from owning land for farming, real estate, and extracting natural resources. They controlled banks and they led industrial endeavors such as railroad and automobile manufacturing. We see that when we think of, what are some of the oldest and largest philanthropic foundations in the US. And that wealth accumulation in our country has a violent history of colonization, indigenous genocide, land theft, and stolen labor from the enslavement of African people. And that wealth accumulation continues to this day through the exploitation of land and labor, specifically at the expense of Black, Indigenous, and people of color's health and vitality. I'm going to pause for a second because that's a lot, but
It
I
is,
think it
and
really,
Andrea, someone was asking, could you make the slide a little bit bigger because they wanted to see what was on the right? Can you do that just
Oh, you
for a
know what?
moment?
I am sharing full screen, but I am happy
Uh,
to share that this is from givingusa.org. So they produce this, I believe, annually.
yeah.
So this is the newest one that's up from 2023. But if you go on their website, they have this for free download. So anyone can have the large, expanded, um, blown up PDF version of this. But on the right
Thanks.
side, it does say, where did charitable dollars go? And it shows at the top 30, the top percent here is religion at 24%, human services, education, foundations, public society benefit, health, international affairs, arts, culture, and humanities, environment slash animals, and then individuals.
Thank you, Andrew.
So
And they'll get the slides, plus we'll get that
they will.
link as
Yeah,
well.
but I encourage, it's fascinating. So I encourage everyone to check out the Giving USA website and see this breakdown. Um, it's also interesting that I've used this slide before and I've updated it over the years. And this 67% from individual donors has stayed consistent, at least over the past 5 years. So while the number of giving has expanded, the division in which people are giving either by individuals, foundations, bequests, and corporations has stayed relatively the same. So I think it's really important to identify the history of something before we're trying to change it. So that's why I shared that background on philanthropy. And in alignment with that, the nonprofit sector's default fundraising philosophy and practices have focused on the comfort of donors, who are mostly white. And this traditional way of fundraising is called donor-centric fundraising. And while it's proven very effective in raising money, it has in many ways been perpetuating the very injustice the nonprofit sector has been trying to end. Um, this is because current practices prevent important conversations about race, inequity, and privilege. It reinforces in donors the unconscious perception of the people we help as merely objects of pity and charity. And these practices have been driving out fundraisers of color while furthering the fact that less than 10% of philanthropic dollars go to Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led organizations and movements. I think it's also very important context to add that in 2018, AFP, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and the Chronicle of Philanthropy conducted a survey and reported that 1/4 of all female fundraisers surveyed had experienced sexual harassment in the field, and in 65% of cases, the perpetrator was a donor. So looking at this for 2023, Giving USA identified that in the United States alone, philanthropy is a $557 billion industry, of which 67% comes from individual donors. And I'll add that this number is low because it doesn't include untraditional or less trackable methods of giving, such as GoFundMe or handing out something to your neighbors in need or putting money on a church offering plate or buying a drink at a lemonade stand for a good cause. This 557 billion is the trackable money. Um, but what we're seeing is that the practices and theories and framework of modern philanthropy and fundraising often ignore the ways in which the sector perpetuates harm. And when I first became a fundraiser, I wasn't able to articulate all of that, but there was this feeling that something was off. I was taught to cater to donors and bend over backwards to please them, despite it conflicting with the external values and vision of the nonprofits. And for half the folks here that are fundraisers, you probably have stories like that. There are things in my head I wish I could forget. And I'm like, why do I know this about this person? Why do I know that they don't like when their steak sauce touches their steak? Because that was such an important note at the gala. Like, why did we prioritize that over sending a volunteer to the gala, for example? There's this scarcity mindset and fear of upsetting donors in a variety of ways that for at least for myself and a lot of the folks that I've talked to, we were kind of taught to live in that fear as fundraisers. Any comments or questions so far?
Yes. Sorry, yes, I can't click buttons. Someone was saying, did you really just say that was that a quarter of female fundraisers have experienced sexual harassment by donors?
Three-quarters, I believe. Let
Oh
me.
God. Whoa.
Yes.
Okay. Well, yeah, then
Oh
give me
no,
the
I'm sorry.
drop.
One quarter of all female
Mm,
fundraisers have experienced sexual harassment of those that were surveyed in this 2018 survey.
okay.
Yes.
And then someone, this is probably something we'll kind of get to as we're talking in general, but they wanted to know, in light of the federal funding cuts, how can small nonprofits collaborate to get access to resources or
Oh yeah.
be able to work together?
Um,
And I think we're probably going to talk about that, right?
yeah, that's a great question. I have some examples of how CCF has been actualized, and it does specifically talk about collaborating with other organizations. So I'll save that for a little bit at the end. Yeah,
Yeah. And Todd just said, isn't it the common expectation of major donors to be catered to?
it is.
Unfortunately. Yeah.
And we've
Unfortunately,
we've
yes.
we've created that beast by catering to
Absolutely.
them. So
Hmm.
yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what we have. So yeah, go ahead.
Perfect. Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So let's move on to the creation of CCF. In 2017, a group of 10 Seattle fundraisers of color, myself included, started meeting regularly. And in all honesty, this was like venting session happy hour. Um, but this group included Vu Le, author of the nonprofit AF blog, who had just begun writing about the harm that donor-centric fundraising perpetuates. And it also included Michelle Muri, who at the time was leading the fundraising campaign for Edgar Villanueva's book, Decolonizing Wealth. And our group quickly realized that we shared feelings of disappointment and frustration with quote unquote best practices and began dreaming what more equitable fundraising could look like. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't just the 10 of us that were feeling this. So in 2018, we invited Seattle area fundraisers of color to gather with us, and 90 people showed up, representing CEOs to emerging fundraising professionals. And for a lot of us, it was our first time meeting each other. I didn't know anybody in that room. Um, and from that convening, three key pillars emerged from our discussions. And it was one, fundraisers of color were craving community. They didn't feel a sense of belonging in historically white-led fundraising associations, and many felt isolated in their jobs. Some were considering leaving the sector, unhappy with traditional fundraising approaches, and a lack of having what they called a values-aligned community. And I can say, even following up with this group of 90 fundraisers of color after, just a few months later, I think like 20% of the email addresses were gone. And, we lost folks in the sector because they didn't feel welcomed. Two, people wanted to shift to more equitable practices in their day-to-day fundraising efforts. So fundraisers cited tokenism, exploiting stories, and being subjected to racist and sexist donor behavior. And people wanted to learn to fundraise in ways that honored their community and methods that didn't lead to burnout and harm. And three, the group recognized that advocacy and collaboration was needed with philanthropy colleagues to create more equitable grant-making practices, and ultimately, less hoops to jump through to secure funding and more trust that nonprofits can do their work efficiently and effectively. So how can we communicate with funders that we can't do that 40-page grant application for $5,000 anymore, and that we need a bit more trust and a bit more power sharing and distribution of resources into community to really not just do our missions, but to really make impact in our neighborhoods. So in 2019, we distributed a survey that received over 2,000 responses, and we learned that the majority of fundraisers surveyed are unhappy with the field. Fundraisers felt like traditional fundraising practices were harmful in the work towards justice, and that there hasn't been enough discussion about the intersection of social justice and fundraising. So with this data, we launched the community-centric fundraising movement in 2020 to share the 10 principles of CCF and to work in community to actualize them. Since then, we've grown over 85 regional chapters of CCF. We've grown an active online community. There's a very large mailing list which shares weekly articles written by CCF fundraisers. And in recognition of the Founding Council's limited geographic perspective, over the past few years, we welcomed a Global Council to oversee future activities. And the Global Council includes 13 people representing various US cities, Canada, Guatemala, El Salvador, South Africa, and Kenya. So that's the background of why and how CCF started. And next, we'll dig into the 10 principles. Any comments or questions before we start the principles?
We're good in terms of questions. Definitely
Great.
some comments. Let me grab. Wait, someone asked. Um, how can we better educate the well-established businesses of color to understand the importance of philanthropy, as many are less inclined to feel comfortable to donate? And that might be
Mm.
something you kind of touch upon as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we'll touch a bit on that later, and also recognizing that communities give in different ways.
Mhm.
Talking about those, less trackable. We've seen that people that have less wealth give more away, and are actually more philanthropic. But we also don't see that on reports because it is giving through churches or it's giving through more grassroots movements. So
Right. Some
I
charts.
definitely think that there's this culture of philanthropy and gratitude among people, and it's how can we how can we illustrate it or identify it when it may look different from, a donor advised fund or a 501(c)(3) donation?
Absolutely. And then someone said, is CCF only open to fundraisers of color? Because you did talk a little bit about there being
Mm-hmm.
chapters.
It's not only open to fundraisers of color, but it is rooted in the experiences of fundraisers of color. So that's how our founding council came to be. And that was also something that was prioritized from our global council. But we also have white folks that are part of CCF and part of CCF leadership and writers for the blog and allies. So it is definitely rooted in the experiences of fundraisers of color, but we all are welcome and needed to make a movement happen.
And the last thing you'll show us, I'm guessing, is like how we can join or learn more, right?
Yes, yeah,
Okay. Okay,
yeah.
perfect. Because people will definitely want to know. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the 10 principles are how we aspire to transform fundraising and philanthropy so that they're co-grounded in racial and economic justice. We believe that CCF is not a one-size-fits-all approach, and that the principles will likely look different in practice at different organizations, depending on variables such as budget size, staff capacity, unique community considerations, focus area of mission, and where the organization may be and how openly they discuss equity and embrace challenging conversations. As I go through each principle, I really want to emphasize that there's a spectrum of ways to actualize these principles, and we'll definitely get to that a little bit later. So, principle one, fundraising must be grounded in race, equity, and social justice. So, While many of us are already embracing uncomfortable conversations about equity with our boards, colleagues, and even volunteers, donors have mainly been exempt. And similarly, we've seen program staff be much more involved in equity trainings and discussions as if it doesn't apply to fundraisers and donors. It's also typical to see program staff more closely represent the demographics of the community they serve. And that sort of shift in mindset and diversity hasn't fully gone to fundraising teams the same way it has for programmatic teams themselves. Principle two, individual organizational missions are not as important as the collective community. So this goes back to the idea of a larger constellation. Scarcity mindset has often put nonprofits in competition with one another, where the larger vision becomes cloudy. Um, I also like to envision how multiple organizations overlap to impact one person. So let's imagine a person named Charlotte. Charlotte may need housing assistance. Then, once she has shelter, she goes on to another organization to gain workforce training. Now, with a steady job, she decides to have a family and she goes to a nonprofit health provider for maternal and infant health care. Her child is set up for success by going to another organization for early education support, and then is mentored and supported to pursue college by another organization, or learns about financial literacy at another. Charlotte and her child benefited from a collective effort and a collective effort of resources. Yet, nonprofits themselves are often losing sight of that collective effort, especially when fundraising. Some organizations hoard their donors, afraid that if a donor knows about the great work of another organization, that they'll take their money elsewhere. And this undermines the donor's ability to make their own decisions, or perhaps decide to support multiple organizations. It's likely that your clients navigate several barriers, such as housing, childcare, or job instability. And instead of seeing fundraising as competition between other organizations, we have an opportunity to build a stronger network by collaborating with other nonprofits. And this ensures that people have the resources they need to succeed. And I'll also add that when we do share with donors that there's other great organizations that are maybe sharing the same or serving the same demographics or neighborhoods, we've seen that people increase their generosity and give more. It's rarely that we see them abandon one organization for another. But it's that scarcity mindset that makes it seem very risky to tell a donor about the great work of another organization. Principle three, nonprofits are generous with and mutually supportive of one another. Working in philanthropy, I met an organization focused on resources for transgender adults. And when I asked about trans youth, they said, yeah, there's a huge need for funding to support trans youth. And that's not our focus. Our skill is connecting with adults, and youth isn't our expertise. But this other organization down the street is doing great work with trans youth. And that's something that really stuck with me because I had been so programmed to think that it was a disservice to yourself to be that level of transparent, to show that you have, what some may think are gaps in your programming. Um, so while some may have thought that this would be less desirable to a funder or donor, um, they instead made this very conscious decision to focus only on their strengths, not to mission drift, and also uplifted a partner organization. Fundraising isn't just about bringing in more dollars for one organization. It's about ensuring neighbors have what they need to thrive. One organization can't meet every person's need on their own, but they can leverage their fundraising power to uplift and support other essential community services. If you're a technical college and the majority of students rely on a food pantry, how can a college actively support the food pantry's fundraising and visibility? If many students at that technical college need childcare to attend class, how can the college partner with childcare providers to ensure access and sustainability? It's not about that technical college competing with the food pantry or the childcare center for donor dollars. It's about recognizing that those students are whole people with complex needs. Principle 4, all who engage in strengthening the community are equally valued, whether volunteer, staff, donor, or board member. I used to work at a museum where there were 40-hour-a-week volunteer docents. They're amazing people, mostly retirees coming from the same profession that they were then educating about and had a wealth of knowledge. And those docents gave so much to the museum. And they got an annual pizza party. Meanwhile, board and high wealth one-time donors receive special recognition, their names on plaques in the building, and much more. There's gratitude practices that have been applied to donors, like ensuring immediate thank you calls and handwritten thank you notes that are seldom applied to volunteers. We may often overlook the everyday contributions that make an organization thrive, or rarely thank clients for their decision to be part of a nonprofit's community. Custodial and maintenance staff who ensure buildings remain safe, clean, and accessible are often celebrated in very isolated moments like administrative appreciation day or a pizza party for a 25-year work anniversary. Meanwhile, a donor who steps on site for the first time with a $10,000 check is treated like royalty, despite having less demonstrated dedication, years of service, or institutional expertise. What would it look like to create a culture of gratitude that honors all who strengthen the institution, not just those with financial capital? And in full transparency, we've heard that it can be hard to actualize this principle because it often requires action from more than just fundraising staff. It requires maybe a volunteer management program or an HR department who's tracking who volunteers are, or collaboration with the program team who manages the docents. Moving on to principle 5, time is valued equally as money. So going back to the volunteers or the staff that stays late or board members that offer their expertise outside of board meetings, time is so valuable, yet hardly valued. Some nonprofits are doing away with board giving requirements, acknowledging that these create barriers for some to join boards, and recognizing that monetary giving does not correlate to commitment. And again, tracking time and tracking this sort of energy and activity does require capacity. This takes us to our next poll. We're halfway through the principles, and I'm curious if they resonate with you so far. So yes, they reflect my values and approach somewhat, but I'm still processing. I'm unsure. I see potential, but have questions. Not really. They feel challenging or risky, or no, I don't see them aligning.
They're still awake. They're still answering. It's good. Yeah, and lots of chatting about,
Oh, nice.
collaboration. Which, by
Great.
the way, we only hear great things about collaborating, nonprofits collaborating. I think the tough part is kind of the logistics of it, but in terms of, wanting to get together for the community, understanding where the value is in both and all that, we've definitely seen that with
Hmm.
nonprofits. All right. I see it's getting a little slow, so we will stop here. And it
Okay,
looks like, let me share the results. Yes, in terms of the principles, they reflect my values and approach. That's 58%, somewhat, but I'm still processing and reflecting, 36%. I'm unsure. I see potential, but I have questions, 6%. And then the last two actually had no people saying so. I will stop
that's
sharing.
great.
Post that.
Thank
Yeah.
you. I'm happy. I'm happy this is going well.
Right.
Happy you're staying curious. And I was trying to skim the chat because it looks like there's some great comments, but there's just so many. Um, I hope to come back to that later. Thanks
Yeah.
everyone for being so engaged. Okay, let's keep moving. Principle 6, we treat donors as partners, and this means that we're transparent and occasionally have difficult conversations. If we're going to talk about root causes and systemic inequity, it gets uncomfortable, but we shouldn't sugarcoat or infantilize donors when we're having challenging conversations with our colleagues, board, and clients. We must have honest, respectful conversations, including strong disagreements as needed with our donors. To share an example, I spoke to a healthcare organization that was working with providers, staff, and board members to address the maternal mortality crisis among Black women. Internally, they took great pride in this work and spoke candidly about the systemic factors contributing to these disparities. However, when it came to donors, they hesitated to discuss issues like death and systemic racism, instead, focusing solely on celebrating the birth of healthy babies through this program. They feared that the full reality of their work would be too heavy for donors to handle. And in doing so, they ended up treating donors with kid gloves, allowing fear to drive their messaging and ultimately presenting a watered down, sanitized version of their impact. Um, so there's this example of, we don't want to be a bummer to donors. We don't want to, bog them down with the weight and heaviness of the same topics and crises that we're talking to our other stakeholders about. We want to have happy dinners and galas with them and get their check and show them the happy babies, but we don't really want to get into this issue with them. I've also seen it be very fear-based of, oh, we know that donor is going to give to us annually, but they don't want to hear about the equity part of that. That happened at an organization I worked with, where we were focused on equitable parks and public spaces, excuse me, of saying, oh, this donor is going to continue to give, but they don't care about more equitable parks or play equipment in communities of color. That's not their thing. Like, let's not even bother telling them about that. Um, they want to know about this other thing. So that happens. That's all I'll say for now. We'll keep going. Principle 7, we foster a sense of belonging, not othering. So othering is a common and effective donor messaging method. You can save Timmy's life by donating $5. You can be Timmy's hero. You can save this person that you seemingly have nothing in common with and no connection to. And we all, wake up on the couch in the middle of the night and see those commercials on where, for $1 a day, you can be Timmy's hero. And there's something effective about that. Like, yeah, I want to be Timmy's hero. Like, wow, I can do basically nothing and be a superhero or a god to this person. But it perpetuates the idea of feeling that charity is when someone gives to someone lesser. And it enforces hierarchy, stereotypes, and it perpetuates divide. So instead of emphasizing hardship narratives, we can highlight clients as future leaders, skilled workers, and vital contributors of a local economy or to a thriving community. And this reframing not only dignifies clients, but also reinforces the idea that investing in services benefits the entire community, not just the recipients. I'm not just contributing because I want to be Timmy's hero. I'm contributing to this organization because I see Timmy as a vital young person who's going to grow up and do something amazing. Um, that hopefully is going to come back, and it's going to be something that myself and my kids and my whole community is going to benefit from. When Timmy has food, shelter, and access to education, my whole community is doing well and will be better for it. Okay, principle 8. We promote the understanding that everyone personally benefits from engaging in the work of social justice. It's not just charity and compassion. So this goes back to collective community. Giving to local nonprofits puts good into their community. It redistributes wealth and power, provides equitable access, and then in turn enriches the neighborhood and benefits the donor. And we really want to encourage donors to recognize that constellation. It's more of a life cycle of how nonprofits are fueling these critical services. Um, and how that's just going to continue to create a more thriving neighborhood. I'm seeing, I don't see the chat, but I'm seeing things pop up. So I am going to pause a second just to skim here. And Yvonne, if you see anything worth um,
Mm-hmm. Stopping right
stating to
now.
me, let me know.
Well,
Yeah.
of course, the question is, going to come up DEI, right? So as soon as we see
Mm,
equity in those words,
yeah.
Alexandra says, do you see challenges with focusing on equity now and in the next few years, given the national knee-jerk reaction against DEI?
Challenges, yes, but I think it should still be happening. I mean, that's the challenge of it. I think it's needed now more than ever, as we would say in our fundraising appeals, where we want to make sure, at least with the CCF, if you're aligned with CCF values, and we're very open with kind of our stance in the world, and we believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion are needed to create thriving communities. And we've seen that when people come into communities to try to make change without having it being community driven, that it frequently creates problems. I mean, there's the classic examples of, white-led organizations going into a town in Africa and trying to change something. But did the people want that change? Did they ask for it? Is it the way that they would go about it? Is it going to have long-term lasting benefits to them, or is it going to create more work and more issues? We see that locally too happening. I'm working with one organization right now that's all about community-driven land use decision making of how do we take a piece of land and create it into something the community needs? And what is that discussion process? And what does community consensus look like? And what do we do when there's all these opposing issues of we need affordable housing, but we'd also really love a library, but we also have we have food insecurity and a group of very diverse immigrants and refugees, and we want an urban farm. And how does community come together to have these sorts of decisions? And traditional philanthropy, when we're talking about what nonprofits were 100 years ago, it was going into communities, telling them how they can be better, and then maybe sticking around for a little while to make change, but then not being a resource in the long term or getting them into something that they didn't want to get to. So I think diversity is definitely, DEI is definitely needed. I think are already seeing pushbacks in federal grants and like the banned list of words that you can't use in grants anymore. Um, I have one client in North Carolina that does performing arts that focuses on Black and queer artists. And as some of you may have heard, like the National Endowments of Arts and Humanities has already said that all funding for 2025 is to go to art that celebrates the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And what does that mean for Black and queer artists in the South? And are they then ineligible for this NEA grants if their work doesn't apply to this? Or jokingly, we're like, what does this mean? Do we need to create the next Hamilton? Like, how do we get around this? Um, is this funding now inaccessible to those who maybe need it the most? Another example from that organization is they've already kind of had to go dark with their gathering and social gatherings for Black and queer artists because they have had people show up that are there to cause problems. So what used to be, a celebrated flyer on a coffee shop info board or bulletin board now kind of has to have this more exclusive or like secretive way of getting the word out, unfortunately. And we've seen that before. We've seen that with trans organizations. We've seen that with reproductive rights organizations where it's not safe to publicly promote what they do or to promote their activities. And there has been kind of these more underground methods of getting the word out and connecting with community, or there's a phone tree, or it's this person knows this person and everyone invites their network. So I think DEI is very much needed. I'm concerned about the obstacles it's going to create for grant making. I'm concerned about the safety and the feeling of safety and fear that it will cause for others, but I'm definitely not giving up on it.
Yeah, I'd like to I just want to add that we've had a lot of funders in for different reasons and classes, and they right now are feeling activated and feel like a community, which is great to hear. Like they're feeling like
Yeah.
we need to protect our grantees and the kind of work that they're doing, and it's on us to be, we need to be a little more careful or we need to consider things, but keep doing the work that you're doing. So I would
Yeah.
say if you do have foundation funders in the audience, talk to them, about how you're feeling.
Mhm.
Ask them how they're doing. This is a time to have community and be in partnership. So
Yeah, I agree. Principle 9. We see the work of social justice as holistic and transformative, not transactional. So we need to be honest about overhead costs. So many organizations skew their overhead to align with grant opportunities, but these parameters have been unrealistic and set problematic expectations. And we need to push back when donors and funders insist on transactional giving. And it gets a bit tricky and sticky because while problematic, it has been effective to tell donors, hey, your $100 will cover the cost of one student's art supplies. And the idea that my $100 will directly impact one person sounds enticing. It goes back to that heroism or that saviorism. I like to think that I can help another person, but if we all give that way, who's paying for the less sexy costs, like the custodial staff to clean the theater? Who's paying for the new light bulbs and batteries? Or who's buying ink for the printer? Or paying for the internet and phone line? Um, in this scenario, we're either positioning nonprofits to only receive restricted revenue, or we're not being transparent about our overhead needs. We need people to see that there's a diverse mix of revenue that allows programs to go on. And we need to be transparent as it gives donors an opportunity to see and appreciate that many elements are needed to make things run. There was a story, I believe it was NPR, maybe This American Life, years ago, and it was a story about an organization that was working to eradicate malaria in Africa. And they gave donors two choices. You could either, give your $25 and it would go directly to fund one net for when people are sleeping so the mosquitoes don't get to them, or it would go to unrestricted. And I believe it was something like over 90% of the donors decided to buy the net. And it created this situation where they then only had funding for these nets, and they had absolutely no funding for staff to distribute the nets into different communities in different towns. There was no funding to pay for the trucks or the rentals needed or the gas in order to do this. There was no funding for GPS or for, mapping or for research to figure out which of these areas were most dense and most needed, the density of the area and which needed the most resources. And it created this issue where people only wanted to fund the tangible thing that seemed very clear to them, but there was this lack of understanding about all of the operations and all of the behind the scenes costs that needed to go into the program. And we're seeing this. We've also kind of created this beast with funders when we've said, yeah, we'll do this $1 million program. We only need 5% to pay our staff for the next, 3 years. And now they believe us when we say that. And that's the problem that we've created. So we need to be really honest about how much it takes to do the work that we do, how much it takes to pay people a thriving wage to get that work done. We see nonprofit staff burn out so much for the amazing work that they're doing. And how can we keep people in good jobs that they want to have that they can still pay their bills for? Principle 10, we recognize that healing and liberation requires a commitment to economic justice. This involves fundraisers and donors grappling with and addressing the root causes of inequity, including the destructive effects of capitalism and how we may be complicit in furthering them through our practices. There are things we may talk about in this group or in a staff meeting or to clients and volunteers that we don't say to donors. And my question is, why is that? Um, I think our sector has infantilized donors for a long time, and we need to lean into the discomfort in order to cultivate transparent and authentic relationships. You want donors that feel strongly about your mission, not donors that you have to tiptoe around. Um, it does come back to that risky and sticky feeling of will we lose money if we're truthful in sharing the complexity of this topic. And you might, but at the end of the day, like, are those the donors you want, or are those the donors you feel like you're kind of stuck with? And what can you do then to find the donors that are truly aligned with you, that are going to be on board and giving you a thumbs up that says, like, yes, I believe in this too. This is totally aligned with my giving wants as well. And this is the impact that I want to see in community. And I see that you're doing it. I love your approach. I see the intentionality. And I might not always agree with every single aspect of your programming, but it's aligned enough with me that I trust you and I see that you're bringing community in. I see that this is community driven. And that's really all I need to know to make my funding decision. Like, those are the donor superstars you want to have. So I hope that you're not feeling stuck with taking this ride with donors that you can't have these sorts of conversations with. So that was an overview of the principles. And I want to emphasize that CCF is not a certification or a membership. We consider CCF to be a movement, and we want to support and encourage fundraisers to re-examine all the fundraising practices you've been taught and to explore how to do fundraising in a way that doesn't perpetuate harm and that furthers social justice. Movements begin with values, which is why we focused on the 10 principles. Movements require change, so we encourage fundraisers, nonprofit professionals, donors, and funders to take action. And movements are supported from the inside out. We can't just call for sector change. we need to shift our day-to-day practices to center community as a sort of everyday dismantling. So I'm curious what you thought of the last five principles. Um, of the last five, which felt the most needed? Six, treating donors as partners. Seven, fostering a sense of belonging. Eight, everyone benefits from engaging in social justice. Nine, social justice is holistic, not transactional. Or 10, economic justice is essential to healing and liberation.
They're so close. Do you see it, Angie?
Yeah,
Yeah, because they're
it's
all really, yeah,
mhm.
they all feel right. So I'll give people another moment. And while I'm doing that, while people are answering, let me see if there was a question in here that I'll go up to the top. How do we address the donor-centric model internally? How can we
Mm.
shift our work culture in the development team to align more with these principles? And this is a great question because I think you're going to tell us. So,
Yeah, yes. And I will say, depending on the size of your team, depending on the transparency you feel like you can have with your team, depending on your position, are you the boss of your team or are you the newest person on your team? There's going to be different ways to actualize this. So hopefully, the examples I have show you that spectrum of what this can look like. But honestly, it's what can I do if it's just me, and I don't have a lot of capacity? What can I do if I'm on a team with 20 other people and none of them like buy into this, but I believe in it? Or what could it look like to shift a whole, university advancement department to be CCF aligned? And just acknowledging that there's a different spectrum to where people are and, the safety they feel in their jobs or the ability to speak up and to make change. So just recognizing that that's definitely going to fluctuate for folks. So I have some examples that are very tiny to some examples that would require a full organizational, board staff, community commitment.
thank you. We're looking forward to that. I'm going to end and
Yeah,
share. So it
it's
looks
pretty
like
split.
it is very split because they're
I
all
love
good.
that.
But
Yeah,
yeah, thank you.
I like
I'm going to
it.
stop sharing and go ahead.
Yeah, I was just reading one comment here, just acknowledging the burnout that happens. So, yes. Yes. Yeah. And for me, community-centric fundraising was one way to shift away from that, to say, oh, there are these things that have just kind of felt icky. What are ways to make changes? And even if I still have to do the icky things, like what are other things I can do? Okay, I just called every donor that gave today, but hey, I'm going to call one volunteer too. And that's something I can do every day where this organization never called to thank volunteers. And maybe my boss knows about it, maybe not. I can argue that it's, cultivating prospective donors. But for me, I'm going to make the switch where every day after I do all of my donor thank you calls, I'm just going to pick one volunteer on a list and just thank them for the time and the expertise that they're giving to our community.
I like that. One thing we talk about is asset-based language and the
Mm.
fact that you want to talk about communities in a respectful, give them keep their dignity, hopeful,
Yeah.
all the good things. And that a lot of times we've been writing grants and having conversations that play to that savior, that play to that, oh, these, this poor community, oh, this,
Hmm.
that kind of narrative, and that even just teaching your partners, your
Yeah.
grantee partners, your funder partners, that's not how we think about our community. That in and of itself is a shift. And if you can
Yeah.
start, writing that way and speaking that way and saying, we're not using that anymore. Oh,
Hmm.
this is what we're thinking. You're already showing the donor that I know this community. That's why I'm here doing
Yeah.
this work. That's why we're the best partners for you. And I'm going to show you the best way to partner. So I think that's
Yeah.
a nice shift that if you hear it, you get it. You're kind of like,
Hmm.
oh. Okay.
Yeah. And honestly, that's one of the things. There's frequently maybe a rift between the fundraising team and the program team. And I think it's for that reason
That is
of the
true.
program team gets to meet these people and get to know them in ways that the fundraisers usually don't and see them as full people that have these
Mm,
experiences with that like asset-based language where the fundraising team might lead to that deficit language of
that is true.
only you can help this person. And I think it's also exciting for the program team when you have that CCF switch because they're like, yeah, that's what I've been telling you for years. And it's like, oh, I know, but when I tell donors, I have to make it sound so sad and lonely. And it's like, no,
Right.
like then it builds better internal team collaboration as well. So I am going to be checking time because I have a lot I want to share with you. So maybe Yvonne,
Mm-hmm.
maybe let me at like 12 or no, you're at 10 after. Maybe we have to keep moving after this. I'm going to go fast.
Okay.
Um, so next I'm going to share some real life examples of CCF in action. And I've just picked a few of the principles here and a few extra examples if we have time for them. But thinking about principle two of individual organizational missions are not as important as collective community. Um, a few years ago, there was a food bank, this was, pandemic times, who hosted a virtual gala and celebrated their 25th anniversary. And as you usually do, you contract with an outside MC who may not be, as intimate with your organization as staff and board. And the MC said, congratulations on your 25th anniversary. Here's to 25 years more. And while I understand what the MC was trying to do, we shouldn't want food insecurity to have a reason to exist in 25 years. And a lot of nonprofits are grappling with their legacy of being cornerstones in community and the idea of achieving their purpose and sunsetting. How do we keep this in mind while also battling scarcity mindset? We want to keep our jobs. We also want to solve problems. How does that work? And how can we just be truthful and transparent with ourselves about that? Um, a more tangible example, some organizations will promote one another. I have one organization in mind that was in the arts realm and requested in-kind donations via an Amazon wish list. So they said something like, please purchase art supplies for our youth artists using our Amazon wish list link. And we also want to share with you that a number of our youth artists are also food insecure. And we partner and admire the work of this other organization that ensures that every student has access to an afternoon snack. So, in addition to sending art supplies to us, we encourage you to send non-perishable food items to them because it's going to be helping the same community of folks that you care about. And we understand that they're not just artists who do art, they're young people who have other needs as well. And this is going to support them to have more time to focus on their creativity if they're not worried about where their next meal is going to come from. Some examples from Principle 6, we treat donors as partners, and this means that we're transparent and occasionally have difficult conversations. As I mentioned, I used to work for a nonprofit that was focused on parks and public space, and we had some donors who seemed only interested in giving to their neighborhood rose garden. Through a donor communication series, we slowly started to talk to these donors about equity through their interest, the rose gardens, by saying things like, have you noticed that not all Seattle neighborhoods have beautiful rose gardens? Let's talk about why that is. Or, hey, you told me the other day that you felt like your life is enriched by having access to this beautiful garden within walking distance of your home. And you told me that your kids play near it every day and that your aging parents find the rose garden to be a place of peace and rest. Do you think others should have access to rose gardens like that? so they can have the same benefits that your family experiences. And we had some difficult conversations with donors and exploring why some neighborhoods have rose gardens and others don't. We started to host walking tours to understand and to see how redlining has shaped Seattle neighborhoods. And this provided the context and illustrated inequitable parks. Some people felt uncomfortable by this truth and they weren't ready to, be open to receive it. But we were transparent about our funding priorities and we're open to dialogue. While some donors left, the authenticity and transparency was recognized and reciprocated by others. And what began as surface level conversations about a love for their neighborhood rose garden gradually deepened into an awareness of the stark differences in park amenities across Seattle. So, this in turn led to frank discussions about the lasting effects of redlining, the ongoing displacement of marginalized communities, and the realization that these disparities in park access are directly tied to racial and economic inequities. So that's an example of what that donor education can look like that manifested through several online newsletters with our more general community level donors. And it also manifested as more one-on-one recurring conversations with major donors. Excuse me. Let's also look at principle 7. We foster a sense of belonging, not othering. So I've seen nonprofits ensure that their photos and stories represent the actual demographic breakdown of the clients they serve. So for example, we've all seen the college pamphlet and we pick it up and it's like 90% Black and brown faces. But then when we learn the actual demographic of the college, maybe the student body is only 20% people of color. So if that's, oops, sorry, oops. If that's the case, 90% of the brochure shouldn't depict students of color. I've also seen nonprofits ensure that clients' stories are told in the client's native language, letting the English translation come second. This also includes making sure client stories aren't extractive. We've seen great success when I was at the Parks Foundation of hiring contracted photographers and writers from the neighborhoods where we were telling the stories. It was way better than sending the random person from a different city over to come into a neighborhood and to help tell a story for a newsletter. Instead, actually having the writers and creators and photographers meet with their neighbors and to have a dialogue is much better storytelling to really understand an issue and the impact of the work. One youth organization compensated youth to share their stories. Um, Another youth arts organization wanted to showcase their programming to donors, but didn't want the donors to just watch students partake in activities. Instead, they decided to invite donors to be programming participants. So at a time when there was no youth present, donors got to experience what it was like to be a student of the arts organization, creating a fun way to understand the experience of youth without having youth present. And to illustrate how to cultivate a sense of belonging with clients, a health organization has committed to writing handwritten thank you notes to their clients instead of donors. They've decided to reprioritize that time, recognizing that these are the people that trusted them with their care or the care of their loved ones. And that for them felt most important than to the folks who have given financial contributions. Some other examples on a more organizational scope. There's one organization in mind that realized they had an annual corporate sponsor that just didn't align with them anymore. It just didn't make sense for the community that they serve to have this large corporation sponsor their activities. They also recognized that this was a really large annual gift that created a lot of reliability and sustainability for their organization. So they actually did some community consensus building. They talked to staff, board, their clients, and their volunteers, and they all decided to go through with this 5-year transition to step away from the corporate sponsor. In years 1 and 2, they said, hey, we need this money. While we don't love what this sponsor represents, we see the good that this money is doing. So in years 1 and 2, we're just going to kind of be quiet and we're going to take this money. In year 3, we're going to let the donor or let the funder know that this is the last year that we'll be taking their money for these reasons. And we invite them to maybe try to do better in community. And if they don't, then we have to end this partnership. And they told community that in year 4, we might not have this money anymore and it might be tight. We might need to let people go. And we've all kind of decided we're willing to take on this challenge and this risk to have more values aligned funders with us. So in year 4, they did not take the money. And luckily, they had done enough pre-work in the following 3 years that they were able to find a more aligned corporate funder to fill that gap. And in year 5, they were on their way. But this was a risk that they decided as a community to take. And not everyone's going to be in the position to do that. They're not maybe going to have the staff and board enthusiasm to do that, or maybe they're just not in the financial place to do that. But I think that's a great example of what CCF can look like when actualized on the larger organizational level. A smaller example of how to recognize donors in a different way, not prioritizing financial capacity, is their time commitment. When I was at the Seattle Parks Foundation, we had a donor group that we called our loyal donors, and they were donors that had given for 5 years consecutively or longer. And we had a lot of donors that were giving maybe annually for 20 years. And that could range from $5 a year for 20 years to, $10,000 a year for 5 years. But we valued that loyalty and that dedication, and that spoke to us really deeply. So we had a special loyal donor event, a loyal donor tea, loyal tea, where annually we'd have a lovely tea with them. But it was really amazing to be seated in a room of folks that had very different financial capacity, but very similar strong commitment to the mission. Um, I will also add that it was those lower and mid-level loyal donors that became the most amazing pathways to plan gifts. So don't discredit your lower and mid-level donors. They might not have the liquid cash now to be major donors, but might want to make that commitment for a legacy gift. Um, Another example from when I was at the Parks Foundation was the evolution of our donor list. We had a newsletter that would come out every so often, a printed one that was mailed, and there was this really strong institutional love for a printed donor list. And I love the evolution of it because at first it was, kind of only your wealthier folks. That, this person gave $250 or more, this person gave 1,000 or more, 10,000 more, $100,000. Um, and as staff, we were having discussions about, what would it mean to be more CCF aligned? And there was still a very strong board attachment and executive leadership attachment to having this list printed. So we said, hey, if we still have to keep printing this list, what could we do to modify it a bit? So then we said, hey, we're going to print every single donor. If you gave us $1 this year, your name is going to be printed in this donor list. And it made our donor list like 5 pages long, which was amazing to see and maybe a waste of paper. But we had every single donor listed on that piece of paper, and it was still in a, financial giving hierarchical order. But that was just the first evolution. And then next we said, well, hey, if we're acknowledging everyone that's given, $1 to $100,000, what about our volunteers? Like we fiscally sponsor neighborhood groups. What about all the community leaders? So then we added on to the list of here's all of our folks that are leading, fiscally sponsored projects and donating their time and energy. And that was then a separate list. And then it evolved some more. And we said, wow, we have some folks that are giving money while also are leading projects, and we have board members who are also, committing to their planned gifts. We have staff who are also monthly donors. Like, what can we do? So the next evolution of it was that we put all the names in alphabetical order, and we came up with this somewhat complicated asterisk system where it's like if you have a blue star next to your name, you're a board member. If you have a purple star next to your name, you're a staff member. If you have a green star, and it just kept going with like you're a loyal donor, a board member, you've committed your planned gift, you're also a volunteer. And it was all these things. And it became this funny little competition of like, how many asterisks do you have? Like, that was the new cool thing. It wasn't, oh, wow, you gave this much money. It's like, I have six asterisks next to my name. You only have three? Hmm. And it was just another evolution to it. And now I can say the organization has decided not to waste their time doing that anymore. So it just was this very long evolution of how can we make this list more equitable to how can we kind of devalue having these names printed in this sort of way. Um, I will
Did
share
you want to
another.
jump into questions now?
Oh,
Because
I
we're,
do. I want to share one more
yeah.
example that's kind of a
Okay.
bigger picture one that was more publicized. This happened in the Pacific Northwest several years ago for the Girl Scouts of Western Washington, and they refused a gift. I believe it was like a six-figure gift. And the person giving the gift was trying to say that it was only for cisgender girls. And Girl Scouts of Washington said, we don't do that. Um, and they said no to this huge gift. And it became a public issue. It became a news story. Um, so they had the bravery to say no to this gift. It conflicted with their values. Everyone in the news saw it and was sort of outraged. And I believe they got three times the amount of donations in that same month with people who were much more values aligned. So just wanted to share that too, where there can be some risks and challenges, but when you publicize it, you can find the people that it sticks with. So, one last poll for you. Hearing all of this, how likely are you to implement or deepen your commitment to CCF?
This is a really good question since we had so many that hadn't even heard of it. So this is cool. Didn't know much about it. So very
Yeah.
likely this aligns with my thinking. And I know that it aligns and you're giving good examples. And I like the examples because this doesn't mean tomorrow you're just going to change
Oh
everything about your
no.
whole, right?
No, and I
So it's
don't
like,
think I don't, but there's others and I can't speak for everyone in CCF, but I don't see CCF as like a light switch that you turn on or off. It can be those simple things of like, I'm just going to start calling one volunteer and I'm going to value my donors and my volunteers. Um,
mhm.
or hey, let's start having a conversation about like our wonky, outdated donor list and let's just kind of ideate on it, even if we can't make changes to it, for a while. Like, let's just acknowledge it. Um,
And we did
but
get a question that's kind of related. How does CCF differ from, complement, and or interact with mutual aid?
hmm, I think mutual aid is great. I think it has such a different sort of grassroots approach to it, where when I think of CCF, I am definitely thinking of um, fundraising in like the professional sector as nonprofit professionals. I
Mhm.
think of fundraising as the counter to the way that we've been doing it, and I think mutual aid has great examples of what it looks like to harness audiences and momentum um, and to fundraise in ways that are outside of what we're
Yeah.
taught in the
Hmm.
professional field.
Yeah, I like that. And I did put in the chat earlier, our next webinar is a people-centered philanthropy, and it'll be much more about like mutual
Oh,
aid and
cool.
those kinds of
Nice.
things. So yeah, you're teeing us up for that. So it looks like
Good.
we have 61% who are very likely because this
Cool. I
aligns with
love
their
that.
thinking. Yep, 33%. I know I should end and share. I'm bad at that. Somewhat likely and then
That's
unsure. I need more
exciting.
information. It is exciting.
No, that is exciting. Thank
Good
you
job,
all. Thanks for
Andrea.
being open. Of
That
course.
that was all you.
Um,
So you're all getting these, just so you know. So everything Andrea is showing us, you
mhm.
will get these slides. So
Yes.
great.
So
Great.
that's my presentation. So yeah, I know we have some more time for questions, but
We
thank you so
do.
much for considering how CCF plays a role in fundraising. If you're looking for more resources, our website is communitycentricfundraising.org. If you don't know Vule's blog, Nonprofit AF, check it out. It is wonderful. And then Michelle Muri, the other founding co-chair of CCF, has a lovely podcast called The Ethical Rainmaker, where she talks about all sorts of topics, but brings it back to CCF aligned topics and things related to the nonprofit world. And if you want to find me, my website is andrea-arenas.com, and here's my email, and find me on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Hey, we're all gonna find you. So Kimberly Copeland says we are a native-led nonprofit and have been very community-centric, and it's almost too community-centric. Shouldn't there be a balance between community-centric and donor-centric to be successful? What do you think?
Hmm. Guess it depends how you define it. I think when I think of donor centric, which might be defining it in different ways, I think about letting donors' wants and opinions be the driving factor. When I think about community centric, it's it's about acknowledging all who contribute to a community and an organization, um, and while there are effective donor-centric practices and how we do cultivation and stewardship, I think it's great to be mindful of, oh, we're going to have a gala and it's for our major donors. How could we make it more accessible to our community level donors? Or can that $10 monthly donor who's been giving to us for 5 years, is this even accessible to them if we're charging, $400 a ticket? How do we make sure that our whole audience is represented at this gala? Or is this a time and place where you truly only want to have high wealth individuals in the room? And I would challenge and say, like, why is that? What would be the harm in having people of all sorts of financial abilities in the room, or people like the volunteers who give in different ways? They give their time and their expertise. So I think we've seen that donor-centric fundraising is proven effective, and how can you hold on to the parts of it you want while also separating yourself from the ones like the othering and the tokenism and the saviorism that might be doing harm to your community?
Gotcha. Irene wants to know, are there models that pair CCF with community participatory research projects? She's just learning, or
Hmm.
Irene is just learning about both of those.
Oh, not that I know of. That'd be a great question for our CCF hub. Um, I can't think of research projects. I do have some examples of organizations that have pooled their resources for fundraising purposes. I know of one organization that, was down the street from another doing something totally different and said, hey, it's kind of our slow season and our grant writer doesn't have a lot to do. Like, can we lend you our grant writer for the summer? Because it's our down season. Like, can we like share resources with one another? Or, hey, can we hire a grant writer together to kind of have like a fractional grant writer that we both have on retainer, but take time from at different moments. I also know, I believe it's the Tacoma Community Foundation. They are a granting organization, but also recognized that there were some really large federal census grants at the time when the census was last coming up. And they were working with a number of small organizations that would be perfect cultural and ethnicity-based organizations that would be perfect fits for the census data funding and didn't have the capacity themselves to do these really hefty federal grants to ask for this assistance. So the Tacoma Community Foundation came together, did some community convening, and said, hey, there's 40 of you, like let's all come together. So they actually did the grant writing on behalf of these 40 organizations and then were able to re-grant that funding so that these smaller cultural and ethnically based organizations then had the funding to make sure that their communities were able to show up and show out for the census. So I
Of
don't know
course,
of research, but
hmm yeah,
yeah,
some
we'll
kind of practice.
find examples.
Of course, we have so many questions left, but we're pretty much at time. We are
Yeah,
so glad to have you here.
thanks
And
for
I don't
having
know
me.
if it was the flu, but I like your spirit. It's very calming and good.
Thank you.
So I want you to be good, but I'm glad that
Yes,
you were here
yeah.
with us today. So many always a lot to talk about. And like I told everyone in the chat, we are having another webinar that will be very similar, but actually talking to the nonprofits who are doing this kind of work kind of outside of
Cool.
traditional philanthropy. And so maybe we'll have you back too. I keep saying we
Yeah,
need a
I love
part two of
that.
everything because we want to keep having these conversations and we're not afraid to. In fact, this is when we need to. So I'm so glad you were here. Thank you to our audience and thank you, Andrea, for
Yeah,
hanging with
thank you,
us even
everyone.
when you
Thanks
didn't
for all
feel
the
great.
comments.
Yeah, and you're gonna get a bunch of new friends on LinkedIn as
I
well.
love that. Yes, please
All
find
right.
me.
All right. Thank you all. We hope to see you at our
Thank
next
you.
webinar. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.